At 8:15 in the morning, a blinding flash turned the sky into hell. The temperature at ground zero reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit, instantly vaporizing everything within a half-mile radius. Buildings collapsed like sand castles, shadows were permanently burned into concrete, and over 80,000 people perished in an instant. Yet in the midst of this apocalypse, 8 men stood merely 4 blocks from the epicenter of the atomic blast and survived. These 8 Jesuit priests lived in a small rectory that remained standing while everything around it was obliterated. The question that haunted military officials, scientists and doctors for decades: how did these men survive without a scratch when everyone within a mile radius was either killed or severely injured? Was it divine intervention, as many claimed, or is there a scientific explanation that the government has kept from us all these years? In August 1945, Hiroshima was a city of strategic military importance to Imperial Japan. Home to approximately 350,000 people, it served as a key supply and logistics base for the Japanese military. The city was largely untouched by conventional bombing, making it an ideal target for America's new weapon. Most citizens went about their daily lives unaware they were living in what military planners had designated as a perfect demonstration site. Among them were 8 Jesuit priests, 6 Japanese and 2 German nationals, who lived in a small parish house near the center of town. Their building, a simple 2-story structure, was unremarkable, except for its proximity to what would soon become the most infamous spot on Earth, the hypocenter of the first atomic bomb used in warfare. Father Hubert Schiffer, a German Jesuit, had just finished morning mass and was eating breakfast when the world changed forever. At age 30, he was the youngest of the priests living in the rectory. The others, ranging in age from 40 to 58, were scattered throughout the building performing their morning routines. The day promised to be hot and humid, typical for Hiroshima in August. The air raid sirens had sounded earlier, but all clear signals followed shortly after, as only a single B-29 bomber had been spotted, deemed too small a formation to be a threat. The citizens of Hiroshima had returned to their regular activities, unaware that the lone American aircraft, the Enola Gay, carried the most destructive weapon ever created. The landscape of Hiroshima was dominated by traditional Japanese architecture, primarily wood and paper structures that would soon become perfect kindling for the atomic inferno. Military facilities, factories and residential neighborhoods sprawled across the relatively flat terrain, intersected by 7 rivers that flowed through the city. The parish house where the Jesuits resided was located in what was considered the modern part of the city, surrounded by concrete buildings, schools and hospitals, all of which would be reduced to rubble within seconds. The proximity of their dwelling to what would become ground zero meant that by all scientific calculations, their survival would be mathematically impossible. As the hands of clocks across the city approached 8:15, the Enola Gay released its payload, and the uranium-235 bomb nicknamed Little Boy began its 43-second descent toward Earth. The device contained enough energy to destroy everything within a 1-mile radius and severely damage structures within 2 miles. Physics, medicine, and probability all dictated that anyone within half a mile of the blast would be instantly killed, either vaporized by the heat, crushed by the shock wave, or fatally irradiated. Yet somehow, in defiance of science and the laws of nature, 8 men would soon find themselves at the center of what many would call a miracle, and what others would see as proof that there are forces at work in our world that even the most advanced military technology cannot explain. The morning of August 6, 1945, began like any other in wartime Japan. Citizens had grown accustomed to air raid sirens and the constant threat of bombing. But Hiroshima had been oddly untouched throughout the war, a fact that puzzled many residents but provided a false sense of security. Unknown to them, this absence of conventional bombing was deliberate. American military planners had intentionally preserved Hiroshima to better assess the full impact of their new weapon. By 1945, Japan was a nation on the brink of defeat. Their navy was decimated, their air force crippled, and their cities bombarded nightly, yet the government refused to surrender. Emperor Hirohito and his military advisors had prepared the population for an American invasion, instructing civilians, including women and children, to fight with bamboo spears and makeshift weapons. American intelligence estimated that an invasion of the Japanese mainland would cost up to 1 million American casualties and potentially 10 million Japanese lives. In this context of desperate resistance and mounting casualties, President Harry S. Truman made the fateful decision to use the atomic bomb. The target committee had selected Hiroshima as the primary target due to its military significance, its largely intact urban area, and its position surrounded by hills that would focus the blast for maximum effect. The city housed the headquarters of the 2nd General Army and the Chugoku Regional Army, responsible for the defense of southern Japan. Additionally, the city was home to numerous factories producing military equipment and supplies. Most citizens, including the Jesuit priests, were unaware that their city had been marked for destruction. The priests went about their spiritual duties, providing comfort to a population suffering from food shortages, constant air raids, and the gradual collapse of Japanese society under the strain of total war. Father Hubert Schiffer and his fellow Jesuits represented an anomaly in wartime Japan. As Catholic priests in a predominantly Shinto and Buddhist nation, they were already outsiders. The presence of 2 German nationals among them made their position even more precarious, though Germany and Japan were allies. Their parish, the Church of Our Lady's Assumption, served a small Catholic community in Hiroshima. The rectory where they lived was a solidly built structure, but unremarkable in its construction, certainly not designed to withstand anything beyond conventional bombing. That morning, as Father Schiffer finished his breakfast, Father Superior Hugo Lassalle was in his office, while the other priests were scattered throughout the building reading, praying, or performing household tasks. None of them paid particular attention to the single B-29 bomber that passed overhead. Such reconnaissance flights had become routine, though usually they involved larger formations. At precisely 8:15 and 17 seconds, the atomic bomb detonated approximately 1,800 feet above the city. The burst created a fireball more than 1 mile in diameter, generating temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. The thermal pulse ignited everything flammable within 2 miles, created hurricane-force winds that toppled buildings, and emitted deadly radiation that penetrated structures and human bodies alike. Within seconds, an estimated 70,000 people were dead or fatally injured. The iconic T-shaped Aoi Bridge, which served as the aiming point for the bombardier, was instantly damaged, yet remained partially standing, a testament to the precise targeting of the attack. The hypocenter, directly beneath the detonation point, was located approximately 550 yards from the Jesuit rectory, a distance that should have guaranteed the death of everyone inside. What happened next defies conventional explanation and has become one of the most scrutinized survival stories of World War II. As the blinding flash engulfed the city, witnesses described seeing the bones in their hands like X-ray images. The blast wave followed, demolishing buildings and sending debris flying at hundreds of miles per hour. Fires erupted spontaneously, merging into a firestorm that consumed what remained of the city. People closer to the hypocenter than the Jesuits were instantly vaporized, leaving only shadows imprinted on walls and steps. Yet inside the rectory, as the world outside was transformed into an infernal landscape, the 8 priests experienced something that would challenge scientific understanding and provide hope to millions seeking meaning in the atomic age. The atomic blast created a shockwave that radiated outward at over 900 miles per hour, flattening everything in its path. Buildings constructed of wood and paper, which comprised approximately 80% of Hiroshima's structures, were instantly reduced to splinters and ash. Even concrete buildings designed to withstand earthquakes and conventional bombing crumbled like sandcastles. Windows shattered up to 12 miles from the hypocenter, and the distinctive atomic cloud rose to 60,000 feet, visible from over 100 miles away. Survivors described the initial flash as brighter than 1,000 suns, followed by a sound like the earth tearing apart. Within moments, a city that had been preparing for another day of wartime hardship was transformed into a smoldering crater of death and destruction. The devastation was so complete that Japanese officials initially believed multiple bombs had been dropped simultaneously. For the 8 Jesuits inside their rectory, the experience was both terrifying and inexplicable. Father Schiffer later recalled being thrown to the ground by a terrible compression, followed by an explosion that felt like being at the center of a tornado. Glass, furniture, and building materials flew through the air. The walls of the rectory shook violently, and portions of the ceiling collapsed. Yet despite their proximity to the blast, a mere 4 blocks from ground zero, none of the priests suffered major injuries. Father Schiffer sustained only minor cuts from flying glass. When the initial chaos subsided, the priests found themselves in a building that, while damaged, remained largely intact. They staggered outside to witness an unrecognizable landscape. Where a city had stood moments before, now there was only a flattened, burning wasteland extending to the horizon. Every other building in their immediate vicinity had vanished. The rectory stood as a solitary structure in a sea of rubble, leading many who later investigated the incident to call it the Miracle House. The contrast between the priests' experience and that of their neighbors could not have been more stark. Just 200 feet from the rectory, school children who had been working in the open as part of the war effort were instantly killed, their bodies charred beyond recognition. In nearby Hiroshima Castle, which had been repurposed as a military headquarters, every person inside perished. Patients and medical staff at Shima Hospital, located almost directly beneath the detonation point, were vaporized so completely that only shadows remained on the walls. Survivors just slightly further from the hypocenter than the priests suffered horrific burns, with skin hanging in strips from their bodies. Many walked with arms extended forward, unable to bear the pain of their burned skin touching itself. Others, blinded by the flash, stumbled through the ruins calling for family members who had already perished. Rather than succumbing to shock or seeking shelter, the Jesuit priests immediately began helping the injured. Despite the continuing danger from fires and collapsing structures, they ventured into the devastated city to offer medical assistance and comfort to the dying. Using their limited medical supplies and improvising with whatever remained intact, they created a makeshift aid station in the partially standing rectory. Father Kleinsorg, one of the Japanese Jesuits, recalled finding a cache of uncontaminated water in the rectory's tank, a critical resource in a city where most water sources had been instantly evaporated or contaminated. The priests tore their own clothing into strips for bandages and worked without rest for days, moving through a landscape so altered that they often became disoriented in what had once been familiar streets. Their survival and immediate response made them among the only organized assistance available in the inner destruction zone during those first critical hours. Military officials who later investigated the bombing found the priests' survival scientifically inexplicable. According to Dr. Stephen Reinhardt, a nuclear physicist from the U.S. Department of Defense who studied the case, there was no scientific explanation for their survival. The rectory was well within the zone where the blast pressure exceeded 8 pounds per square inch, enough to demolish concrete and steel structures, let alone the wooden portions of the Jesuit house. The thermal radiation at that distance would have ignited any flammable material and caused third-degree burns to exposed skin. Perhaps most inexplicably, none of the priests suffered from radiation sickness in the days, months, or years that followed, despite being well within the zone where acute radiation poisoning was nearly universal among survivors. While hundreds of thousands of hibakusha, atomic bomb survivors, later developed leukemia, cancers, and other radiation-related illnesses, medical examinations of the priests revealed no radiation effects whatsoever. In the chaos following the explosion, communication with the outside world ceased entirely. Japanese military authorities in Tokyo knew only that Hiroshima had gone silent. All radio transmissions from the city stopped at 8:15 that morning. The first official report came from a Japanese pilot who flew over the city 30 minutes after the bombing and radioed back the chilling message: Hiroshima has been destroyed by a new type of bomb. The city is burning. When this news reached Emperor Hirohito, he dispatched his military aide Yoshi Sakuma to assess the damage. Sakuma's train could only reach the outskirts of the city, where he was forced to continue on foot through a landscape he described as hell on earth. Meanwhile, the Jesuit priests had become critical first-hand witnesses to the immediate aftermath. Father Siemers, one of the German Jesuits who had been in a building outside the city during the blast, but returned immediately after, documented what he saw. The center of the city was a sea of flames, and the wounded came crawling from the flaming houses, their bodies blackened, burned, bleeding, and in rags. Many were naked or had only shreds of clothing torn to ribbons by the blast. His written account would later become one of the most important early documents detailing the effects of nuclear weapons on a civilian population. The priest's immediate response was remarkable, not only for their physical ability to help, seemingly unaffected by injuries that had incapacitated or killed everyone around them, but also for their psychological resilience in the face of unprecedented horror. Father Kleinsorge spent hours carrying water to burn victims who begged for relief from their thirst, though medical knowledge at the time did not yet recognize that radiation exposure creates an unquenchable thirst. Father LaSalle, despite bleeding from cuts on his face, led a group of survivors to Asano Park, one of the few open areas not consumed by fire, establishing a makeshift refuge. The priests worked through the night as fires continued to consume what remained of the city. By morning, they had helped dozens of survivors and administered last rites to countless dying. Their rectory became one of only a handful of buildings where the injured could find shelter within the inner destruction zone. Military scientists would later calculate that the structure stood in a place where the force of the blast reached approximately 7 tons per square foot, enough pressure to demolish reinforced concrete bunkers. While the priests worked tirelessly among the survivors, American military officials monitored the aftermath from a safe distance. The specially modified aircraft that had accompanied the Enola Gay carried scientific instruments to measure the bomb's effects. Reconnaissance planes dispatched in the following days took photographs documenting the extraordinary pattern of destruction. Analysts noted with interest the peculiar sight of a single standing structure near Ground Zero, the Jesuit rectory, surrounded by absolute devastation. The official report merely noted it as an anomalous structure requiring further investigation. That investigation would come 3 weeks later when an American military scientific team entered Hiroshima after Japan's surrender on August 15th. Led by Brigadier General Thomas Farrell and physicist Robert Serber, the team's primary mission was to assess the weapon's effectiveness, but they also sought to understand how any structure or person could have survived so close to the hypocenter. By the time American investigators reached the Jesuit rectory, the priests had been working continuously for weeks, helping survivors and documenting what they had witnessed. The scientists were stunned to find the clerics not only alive, but showing no signs of radiation poisoning. Blood samples were taken, the building was examined, and extensive interviews were conducted. The priests reported their experiences willingly, seeing no conflict between scientific inquiry and what many of them had already begun to describe as miraculous intervention. Father Schiffer told the investigators, "We believe that we survived because we were living the message of Fatima. We lived and prayed the rosary daily in that home." The American team documented the priest's testimony, but classified much of their findings about the anomalous survival. The official report submitted to Washington mentioned only that certain structures exhibited unusual resistance to blast effects, without elaborating on the human survivors inside. In the months that followed, as Hiroshima began the long process of rebuilding, the story of the 8 priests spread among survivors and reconstruction workers. The Japanese, regardless of their religious beliefs, began referring to the rectory as the Miracle House. Pilgrimages to the site became common, even as radiation continued to claim victims throughout the city. Father Kleinsorge, who had been born in Germany but became a Japanese citizen, remained in Hiroshima for the rest of his life, eventually succumbing to radiation-related illness in 1977. Though his exposure came from his rescue work in the days after the bombing, not from the initial blast. The other 7 priests lived well beyond the life expectancy of radiation survivors. Father Schiffer lived to the age of 82, dying in 1982 without ever showing any effects from radiation exposure. When asked about their survival in the decades that followed, all 8 men gave the same answer. Their devotion to the rosary, as instructed by the Virgin Mary at Fatima, had protected them from the deadliest weapon ever created by mankind. The scientific community remained deeply skeptical of the priests' explanation for their survival. By 1946, American scientists had thoroughly documented the effects of radiation on the human body through extensive studies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors. Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, reviewed the Jesuit case personally and found it disturbing to our understanding of radiation physics. According to the prevailing scientific knowledge, anyone within 1 kilometer of the hypocenter should have received a lethal dose of radiation, approximately 9 Gray units, when just 4 is typically fatal. Blood samples from Hiroshima survivors at similar distances showed severe chromosomal damage, precursors to the cancers that would claim many lives in the decade that followed. Yet repeated tests on the Jesuits showed no such damage. The Manhattan Project scientists who had created the bomb proposed various theories. Perhaps the rectory's walls contained some unknown material that blocked radiation. Maybe the priests had an unusual genetic resistance. Possibly they had been shielded by the precise angle of nearby buildings that were destroyed in the blast. Each theory was investigated and ultimately rejected as insufficient to explain their complete immunity to effects that killed thousands of others at similar or even greater distances from the blast. While scientists searched for answers, military intelligence took a different approach to the Jesuit miracle. Recently declassified documents reveal that both US and Soviet intelligence services monitored the priests closely in the decades following the war. The Soviets, racing to develop their own nuclear arsenal, were particularly interested in any phenomenon that might neutralize atomic weapons. KGB files from 1947 show that Soviet agents attempted to obtain fabric samples from the priests' clothing and even planned an operation to exhume the body of Father LaSalle's housekeeper who had been killed in the blast while standing outside the rectory. The Americans, meanwhile, included the Jesuits in a classified study called Project Sunshine, which tracked radiation effects in selected Hiroshima survivors. The priests were classified as Anomalous Subjects Group J and periodically interviewed and examined until 1963, when the project was discontinued. The findings remain classified, though Freedom of Information Act requests have revealed redacted documents referring to unexplained cellular regeneration and abnormal resistance to chromosomal degradation in the subjects. The Catholic Church approached the Hiroshima Jesuit miracle with characteristic caution. While allowing the priests to share their story, the Vatican never officially declared their survival miraculous, a process that requires extensive investigation and elimination of all natural explanations. Father Francis Spillman, the Vatican's scientific consultant assigned to evaluate the case in 1952, concluded that while the survival of the priests defies current scientific understanding, we cannot definitively rule out an as yet unknown natural mechanism. Nevertheless, devotion to Our Lady of Fatima surged worldwide as the story spread. The message of Fatima, delivered to 3 Portuguese children in 1917, had included warnings about a future war and the spread of Russia's errors throughout the world, interpreted by many as a prediction of Soviet communism. The final part of the Fatima message, the so-called Third Secret, was kept sealed by the Vatican until 2000. Some Catholic scholars propose that the Jesuits' survival was connected to this undisclosed portion of the prophecy, suggesting it contained specific warnings about nuclear weapons and promises of protection for the faithful. The Jesuit priests themselves contributed to the ongoing historical record through their detailed testimonies. Father John Seamers wrote a comprehensive account titled Hiroshima, a Doctor's Detailed Eyewitness Account, which was published in 1946 and became one of the earliest detailed records of the bombing available to the American public. Father Hubert Schiffer, the most vocal of the survivors, traveled extensively throughout the United States in the 1950s and 60s, speaking about his experience. During a Eucharistic Congress in Philadelphia in 1976, Father Schiffer stated, "There was one thing we never could understand. We were 400 to 500 meters from the center of the explosion, the so-called epicenter, and everyone within a radius of 1.5 kilometers from the epicenter died. We were 8, and all 8 lived. How come we weren't dead? Why are we still alive?" This was no explanation. It was told us that our house was overprotected by another building. But this was nonsense. The testimonies of Schiffer and the other priests added a dimension to the historical record of Hiroshima that transcended political and scientific narratives, touching on fundamental questions about faith, survival, and meaning in the nuclear age. In 1951, U.S. military officials commissioned a secret-scale model of Hiroshima showing the exact pattern of destruction, preserved today at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. The model clearly shows the Jesuit rectory standing in isolation amid total devastation. Dr. Raisuke Shirabe, a Japanese physicist who studied the bombing's effects, noted the statistical impossibility of the priest's survival. If one were to calculate the mathematical probability of 8 men surviving at that distance from ground zero without any serious injury, the number would be so small as to be essentially zero. For comparison, of 35 patients in Hiroshima's Red Cross Hospital, located 1/5 of a mile farther from the blast than the rectory, 31 died immediately despite being inside a reinforced concrete building. The hospital's 2-foot-thick concrete walls, specifically designed to withstand earthquakes and conventional bombing, offered no meaningful protection. That the wooden sections of the Jesuit house remained standing defied all models of blast physics developed during and after the war. The Jesuit miracle took on new significance during the Cold War as both superpowers accumulated enough nuclear weapons to destroy human civilization many times over. The story of the 8 priests became a powerful symbol in the growing anti-nuclear movement of the 1950s and 60s. Father George Zabelka, a Catholic chaplain who had blessed the crews of the Enola Gay before their mission, became an outspoken peace activist after meeting Father Schiffer in 1954. Zabelka later wrote, "Meeting Father Schiffer changed everything for me. Here was a man who should have been incinerated, yet he lived without hatred for those who dropped the bomb. His survival convinced me that working for nuclear disarmament was God's will." In Japan, the story resonated across religious boundaries. Buddhist monks at the Gokokuji Temple, just 1 mile from the hypocenter, incorporated the account into their own narrative of spiritual protection despite their theological differences with Christianity. Hiroshima survivors, regardless of faith, made pilgrimages to the rebuilt Church of Our Lady's Assumption, seeking to understand how anyone could have survived in the heart of the atomic inferno. The scientific anomaly of the priests' survival extended beyond their initial escape from death. In the years following the bombing, approximately 70% of all survivors within 1 mile of the hypocenter developed some form of cancer attributed to radiation exposure. The expected cancer rate among the 8 Jesuits, based on their location, was 100% according to epidemiological models developed by the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, ABCC. Yet none of the 8 developed any radiation-related illness throughout their lives. Father Schiffer was examined by more than 200 scientists over the course of his life, including radiation specialists from the ABCC, the forerunner to the Radiation Effects Research Foundation. In his final documented interview before his death in 1982, he stated, "We were examined and our blood counted, but they found no radiation effects, nor has any of us suffered the radiation sickness so common to many of those who survived the explosion." This outcome confounded medical researchers and led to multiple classified studies by both American and Soviet scientific teams attempting to identify any unique physiological or genetic factors that might explain their immunity. The Hiroshima Jesuit house became part of a pattern that puzzled atomic researchers, a small number of buildings and individuals that survived against all odds. The Genbaku Dome, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, was directly beneath the blast yet remained partially standing because the force came directly from above. The Fukuromachi Elementary School, though severely damaged, maintained portions of its structure, despite being only about 400 meters from the hypocenter. However, in both cases, everyone inside these buildings was killed instantly. The Jesuits represented the only case where both the structure and its occupants survived at such proximity to ground zero. In 1964, Dr. Akizuki Tatsuichiro, a Japanese physician who survived the Nagasaki bombing, published research examining anomalous survival cases from both cities. He proposed what became known as the shadow theory, that certain structures created shadow zones, where blast, heat, and radiation effects were minimized through complex wave interference patterns. However, when applied to the Jesuit rectory, the theory failed to account for all aspects of the priests' survival, particularly their long-term radiation immunity. Political sensitivities complicated public discussion of the Jesuit miracle. In post-war Japan, where state Shintoism had been disbanded and American occupation forces promoted secularism, stories with religious overtones were often downplayed in official histories. The nascent Japanese peace movement preferred to emphasize the universal human suffering of Hiroshima rather than accounts that suggested divine favoritism. In America, the story received minimal mainstream coverage during the 1950s, as it potentially undermined the prevailing narrative that the atomic bombing had been a regrettable but necessary action to end the war without an invasion of Japan. Cold War propaganda on both sides weaponized the Hiroshima narrative. Soviet media occasionally referenced the Jesuit survival as evidence of American moral bankruptcy, suggesting that even God intervened to protect the innocent from American atrocity. Meanwhile, some American religious publications presented the story as evidence of divine judgment, protection for Christian missionaries, while the militaristic Japanese empire was punished. Both interpretations distorted the priest's own understanding of their experience, which focused on the rosary's protection rather than any national or political dimensions. Father Pedro Arrupe, who would later become Superior General of the Jesuit Order worldwide, had been serving as Master of Novices in Nagasaki when the second atomic bomb fell 3 days after Hiroshima. Though his building was on the opposite side of a hill from the blast and thus shielded, he rushed into the destruction zone to help victims, drawing on his medical training. After meeting with the Hiroshima Jesuit survivors in late 1945, Arrupe became convinced their experience held profound significance. In his memoir, he wrote, "The survival of my brothers in Hiroshima can be explained in no human way. I have studied the effects of the bomb scientifically. I have seen its victims with my own eyes. I have treated radiation sickness. There is no natural explanation for why these 8 men lived when all others died." Arrupe would later use this conviction to shape the Jesuit order's stance on nuclear weapons, making opposition to nuclear proliferation a central focus of Jesuit advocacy. His personal experience with the bombings and the miracle of the 8 priests transformed the 400-year-old religious order's approach to social justice and peace activism in the modern era. In 1976, during the International Eucharistic Congress in Philadelphia, Father Schiffer made his most comprehensive public statement about the experience. Before an audience of thousands, including nuclear physicists, military officials, and religious leaders, he described the moment of the blast. Suddenly, a terrific explosion filled the air with one bursting thunderstroke. An invisible force lifted me from the chair, hurled me through the air, shook me, battered me, whirled me round and round. He continued, explaining how he regained consciousness in the midst of unimaginable destruction. Where I had stood the day before stood no buildings, but only a burned-out desert of rubble and ashes. The scientific delegation at the Congress, led by Dr. Stephen Reinhardt of the U.S. Department of Defense, pressed Father Schiffer for details that might explain their survival. The priest's response was unwavering. "We believe that we survived because we were living the message of Fatima. We lived and prayed the rosary daily in that house." When Reinhardt pointed out that many devout Catholics had died in the blast, Schiffer acknowledged this truth, but suggested their survival was meant as a sign, not of God's preference for certain victims over others, but as a demonstration that faith could transcend even the most destructive forces humans had created. This explanation failed to satisfy the scientific community, but resonated deeply with religious observers across denominational lines. The mystery deepened when architectural analysis revealed that the Jesuit rectory possessed no special structural features that might explain its survival. Unlike the Genbaku dome, which had a reinforced central column that remained standing, the rectory was of standard construction for its era. In fact, portions of the building were primarily wood frame, materials that were instantly incinerated elsewhere in the blast zone. In 1980, Japanese architect Shigeru Nishino conducted a detailed analysis of all surviving structures in Hiroshima and found that the rectory defied all patterns observed in other buildings. His report noted, The survival of the Jesuit structure cannot be explained by shielding, material composition, or orientation relative to the blast. By all measurable criteria, it should have been completely destroyed. Nishino's findings renewed scientific interest in the case, just as the living witnesses were reaching the end of their lives. Father Schiffer, the most frequently interviewed of the survivors, died in 1982. Before his death, he participated in one final scientific study, conducted jointly by American and Japanese researchers, which included genetic analysis not available in earlier decades. The results, published in the classified journal Radiation Research Quarterly, documented no genetic damage whatsoever in his cells, a finding described in the paper as without precedent in the literature of radiation exposure. The Church of Our Lady's Assumption was rebuilt in 1950 on the same site as the original rectory, incorporating some of the surviving structure. It became a pilgrimage destination for Catholics worldwide and a poignant symbol within Hiroshima itself. The church stands today amidst the modern city that rose from the ashes, its simple design bearing little resemblance to the structure that survived the blast. Inside, a small museum preserves artifacts from that day, including Father Schiffer's glasses, which were on his face during the explosion, yet remained unbroken, and a partially melted rosary found in the rubble. The church's guest book contains entries from visitors of all faiths and nationalities, many expressing wonder at the story of survival. In August 2005, on the 60th anniversary of the bombing, Pope John Paul II sent a letter to be read at the church, stating, "The survival of the priests of Hiroshima reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hour, there remains the light of divine presence." The Vatican stopped short of declaring the event an official miracle, maintaining its traditional caution regarding supernatural claims, but the papal acknowledgement gave the story new prominence in Catholic teaching about modern warfare and nuclear weapons. Throughout the decades following World War II, as nuclear arsenals grew and the Cold War intensified, the story of the Jesuits of Hiroshima took on additional layers of significance. During the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when nuclear war seemed imminent, devotion to Our Lady of Fatima surged globally, with many Catholics explicitly citing the Hiroshima priests' survival as evidence that prayer could offer protection even from nuclear apocalypse. The Soviet government, through its elaborate network of informants within religious communities, noted with concern the spread of Fatima devotions in Eastern Bloc countries, particularly Poland and Czechoslovakia. A 1964 KGB report, declassified after the fall of the Soviet Union, specifically mentioned the Hiroshima Jesuit phenomenon as a dangerous counter-narrative to state atheism. The account of priests surviving an atomic blast undermines our scientific materialist explanation of reality and provides religious elements with a powerful propaganda tool. This concern was well-founded. Throughout the Cold War, the Jesuit survival story remained one of the most compelling religious narratives associated with the nuclear age, offering hope of transcendence in the face of seemingly omnipotent destructive technology. The medical mystery of the priest's immunity to radiation effects continued to intrigue researchers long after the bombing. Dr. James Neal, who led the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission's genetic studies from 1947 to 1956, maintained a special file on the Jesuits that remained classified until 1998. When finally released, the documents revealed that Neal and his team had collected detailed medical histories of all 8 men, along with blood and tissue samples periodically taken throughout their lives. The samples showed none of the chromosomal abnormalities universally present in other survivors, from similar distances to the hypocenter. Most puzzling to Neal was the priest's complete absence of cataracts, a nearly universal consequence of radiation exposure that affected over 95% of survivors within 1 kilometer of ground zero. In his personal notes, Neal wrote, "The absence of radiation effects in these subjects cannot be explained by any known mechanism. Either they received dramatically less radiation than their location would indicate, which contradicts all our mapping data, or some unknown factor protected them at the cellular level." This paradox remains unresolved in scientific literature, with the Jesuit case still cited in medical textbooks as an anomalous result that challenges our understanding of radiation's effects on human tissue. The historical significance of the Jesuits' survival extends beyond religious or scientific curiosity. It fundamentally challenged how military planners viewed nuclear weapons. In 1954, during the Castle Bravo nuclear test at Bikini Atoll, unexpected weather conditions caused radioactive fallout to contaminate inhabited islands and a Japanese fishing boat, the Lucky Dragon 5. As the crew developed radiation sickness, public outcry grew globally about the dangers of nuclear testing. During classified congressional testimony about the incident, Dr. Shields Warren, director of the Atomic Energy Commission's Division of Biology and Medicine, was questioned about the predictability of radiation effects. According to declassified transcripts, Representative Chet Holofield specifically asked about the Hiroshima Jesuits. How do you explain these men showing no radiation effects when we know the dose they received should have been fatal? Warren's response was candid. Congressman, we have no explanation. Their survival confounds our understanding and suggests our models may have significant gaps. This admission contributed to a growing recognition that nuclear weapons possessed unpredictable effects that couldn't be fully controlled, ultimately influencing the push for the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which prohibited above-ground nuclear testing. The inexplicable survival of 8 men in Hiroshima had revealed the limitations of scientific certainty in the nuclear age. The psychological impact on the survivors themselves revealed another dimension of the story rarely discussed in official accounts. Father Kleinsorger, who remained in Hiroshima after the war and became a Japanese citizen, taking the name Father Makoto Takakura, developed significant survivor's guilt despite his faith in divine intervention. In private letters to Jesuit superiors, declassified in 2004, he wrote, "I am troubled constantly by the question, why us? Why were we spared when so many innocent children perished? What purpose could God have that required our survival amid such suffering?" This existential struggle led Kleinsorg to dedicate his life to working with orphaned victims of the bombing, establishing a home for children who had lost their parents to RAD. Klyashyn's sickness. Despite his own eventual illness from radiation exposure during his rescue work, Kleinsorger remained in Hiroshima until his death in 1977, becoming an iconic figure in the city's recovery. When interviewed by John Hersey for his landmark book Hiroshima, Kleinsorger deflected questions about divine protection, focusing instead on the human suffering he witnessed. "I cannot speak of miracles when I remember the faces of burned children crying for their parents in the ruins." This scientific quest to explain the Jesuits' survival took an unexpected turn in the 1990s, with advances in understanding radiation hormesis, the theory that low doses of radiation might stimulate cellular repair mechanisms. Dr. Thomas Lucky, a biochemist at the University of Missouri, proposed in 1991 that the priests may have received a unique pattern of radiation exposure that triggered protective cellular responses rather than damage. His hypothesis suggested that the precise angle of the blast, combined with the building's structure, created a zone where radiation was present but at levels that stimulated rather than destroyed cellular function. The theory gained limited traction within scientific circles, but was ultimately rejected when detailed mapping of radiation patterns from the bombing showed the rectory received doses far exceeding any potentially hormetic level. In 2007, researchers at Hiroshima University used advanced computer modeling to reconstruct the exact radiation distribution throughout the city. Their findings, published in the journal Health Physics, concluded the Jesuit rectory was located in a region that received approximately 8 gray units of initial radiation, a dose associated with 100% mortality in all other documented cases. No known biological mechanism can explain survival without injury at this exposure level. The human dimension of the story continued to evolve as the last of the 8 priests passed away. Father Pedro Arrupe, who had been in Nagasaki during the second bombing and later met with the Hiroshima survivors, became Superior General of the Jesuit Order in 1965. Under his leadership, the Society of Jesus took strong positions against nuclear proliferation, with Arrupe often citing the Hiroshima priests' experience as formative in his thinking. In 1982, during the height of renewed Cold War tensions, Arrupe declared, "Having witnessed the effects of nuclear weapons and having known those who miraculously survived them, I can state unequivocally that these weapons represent an evil that cannot be justified under any circumstances." His stance put the Jesuit order at odds with some Catholic hierarchies in nuclear-armed nations, particularly in the United States, where Cold War politics often aligned the Church with strong defense policies. This tension highlighted how the Hiroshima Jesuit story transcended simple categories of faith versus science, becoming instead a complex narrative that challenged both religious and secular authorities to reconsider their understanding of nuclear weapons. The most remarkable aspect of the Jesuit miracle may be how it bridged seemingly irreconcilable worldviews. For believers, it offered tangible evidence of divine protection through Marian devotion. For scientists, it presented an anomaly that expanded the boundaries of research into radiation effects. For peace activists, it provided a powerful symbol of humanity's capacity to survive even the most destructive forces we create. For historians, it preserved a unique first-hand account of ground zero that would otherwise have been lost. Dr. Robert Lifton, in his psychological study of Hiroshima survivors, Death in Life, noted this unique bridging function. The Jesuit narrative serves as a point of intersection between radically different ways of processing the atomic experience. Whether one attributes their survival to divine intervention, unknown scientific factors, or simple statistical improbability, the fact remains that their witness forced both the religious and scientific communities to acknowledge the limitations of their explanatory frameworks. Perhaps this is the true legacy of the 8 priests who survived the impossible. Their experience created a space where faith and science, rather than standing in opposition, each reached the boundaries of their understanding and recognized the mystery that remained. The aftermath of the atomic bombing created an unprecedented humanitarian crisis that shaped the priests' remaining years. In the weeks following the explosion, radiation sickness swept through the survivor population, causing hair loss, bleeding gums, purple skin lesions, and agonizing deaths. Estimates suggest that by the end of 1945, over 140,000 people had died from the immediate blast and subsequent radiation poisoning, approximately 40% of Hiroshima's pre-bombing population. The city's medical infrastructure had been decimated. Of 150 doctors in Hiroshima before the bombing, 65 were killed instantly and most of the remainder were injured. In this desperate situation, the Jesuit priests' continued good health and ability to work made them invaluable. Father Kleinsorger, despite not being a physician, performed rudimentary medical procedures for months following the bombing. Using medical supplies airdropped by American forces after Japan's surrender, he treated radiation burns, set broken bones, and comforted the dying. His diary, preserved at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, records his daily struggle. "Today, I counted 37 deaths in our makeshift hospital alone. Still, I feel no illness myself, which the Japanese doctors find incomprehensible. They warn me daily that my own symptoms will begin soon, yet 3 months have passed, and I remain untouched by the disease claiming everyone around me." International reaction to the priest's survival story evolved dramatically over time. Initially, American occupation authorities restricted reporting on atomic bomb effects, concerned about both military security and potential public relations problems. When John Hersey's landmark article, Hiroshima, was published in The New Yorker in August 1946, it included brief mentions of the Jesuit priests, but focused primarily on 6 other survivors who experienced severe injuries and radiation sickness. The full story of the Jesuits emerged gradually through Catholic publications, first in Japan, then in Germany, where Fathers Schiffer and LaSalle had family, and finally in the United States. By 1950, as Cold War tensions escalated following the Soviet Union's first nuclear test, religious communities worldwide seized upon the story. Father Schiffer was invited to speak at parishes throughout America, drawing crowds of thousands eager to hear first-hand testimony of survival against impossible odds. His standard presentation included scientific diagrams of the bombing, medical statistics on radiation fatality rates, and his own unwavering attribution of survival to the rosary. These presentations received minimal mainstream media coverage, but spread widely through religious networks, creating a parallel narrative of Hiroshima that emphasized spiritual dimensions largely absent from secular accounts. The scientific establishment's engagement with the Jesuit miracle case evolved significantly over decades. Initial classified investigations by Manhattan Project scientists focused narrowly on potential shielding effects or structural anomalies that might explain the building's survival. By the 1960s, as understanding of radiation biology advanced, attention shifted to the priest's unprecedented medical outcomes. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, established by President Truman to study long-term effects of radiation exposure, maintained a special classification for the Jesuits, Unexplained Survival Group A. When Jesuit survivor Father Wilhelm Kleinsorge finally died in 1977, the first of the 8 to pass away, his death came not from radiation-induced cancer, but from complications of hepatitis contracted through blood transfusions given to bombing victims he had treated. The Japanese government granted special permission for an autopsy specifically to examine his tissues for radiation effects. The results, initially classified but released under Freedom of Information Act requests in 2001, showed no cellular or chromosomal damage consistent with radiation exposure, despite his presence just 500 meters from the hypocenter. Dr. James Yamazaki, who conducted the examination, wrote in his confidential report, "Based on all available dosimetry data for his location at the time of detonation, Father Kleinsorge should have received approximately 8 gray units of radiation, twice the dose considered lethal. Yet his bone marrow samples show no evidence of exposure whatsoever. This finding contradicts all established understanding of radiation physics and biology." The political implications of the Jesuits' survival created diplomatic complications during the Cold War. As Hiroshima became a powerful symbol in the growing anti-nuclear movement, different nations appropriated its narrative for their own purposes. The Soviet Union emphasized the horror and American responsibility, while downplaying any religious dimensions of the bombing. American authorities highlighted the military necessity while acknowledging the tragedy. In this polarized environment, the Jesuit miracle became politically problematic for both superpowers. For the officially atheist Soviet Union, any suggestion of divine intervention undermined their materialist worldview. For the United States, the implication that God had specifically protected Catholic priests, while American actions killed thousands of civilians, created uncomfortable moral questions. When Father Hubert Schiffer was invited to address the United Nations Special Session on Disarmament in 1978, behind-the-scenes diplomatic pressure from both American and Soviet representatives led to his invitation being rescinded. A declassified State Department memo reveals the reasoning. While Father Schiffer's personal testimony is compelling, his religious interpretation of survival creates unnecessary complications in the disarmament dialogue. Scientific and humanitarian perspectives should remain our focus at the UN Forum. Despite this official marginalization, Schiffer's account spread through unofficial channels and remained a powerful counter-narrative throughout the nuclear freeze movement of the 1980s. The legacy of the Hiroshima Jesuits continues to reverberate through both scientific and religious communities today. In 2010, the International Atomic Energy Agency convened a special symposium on anomalous radiation exposure cases, with the Jesuit survival featured prominently as an unresolved scientific mystery. Dr. Elena Buglova, head of the IAEA's Incident and Emergency Center, acknowledged in her opening address, "The Hiroshima Jesuit case remains the most statistically improbable survival in the history of radiation exposure. No subsequent nuclear incident, not Chernobyl, not Fukushima, has produced any comparable anomaly." Meanwhile, within Catholic tradition, devotion to Our Lady of Fatima experienced a resurgence in the early 21st century, with the Hiroshima priests frequently cited as evidence of the Virgin Mary's protective power. When the third secret of Fatima was finally revealed by the Vatican in 2000, many believers were disappointed that it contained no explicit reference to nuclear weapons or the Hiroshima priests. Vatican officials explained that the timing of the original Fatima apparitions in 1917, decades before the atomic age, made such specific prophecies unlikely. Nevertheless, the association between Fatima devotion and protection from nuclear harm remains deeply ingrained in Catholic consciousness, with the Jesuit miracle serving as its foundational narrative. Today, the Church of Our Lady's Assumption stands as a quiet monument amidst Hiroshima's modern skyline. The rebuilt structure bears little resemblance to the original rectory, but a small chapel within contains preserved remnants of the building that survived the blast. A plaque outside, written in Japanese and English, tells visitors, "On this spot, 8 Jesuit priests survived the atomic bombing of August 6, 1945, despite being only 500 meters from the hypocenter. Their miraculous survival has never been scientifically explained." The church receives thousands of visitors annually, including many non-religious tourists drawn by the historical anomaly rather than spiritual significance. Japanese guides frequently include it in tours of atomic bomb sites, presenting the survival as one of many mysteries from that day. The current pastor, Father Makoto Yamamoto, maintains an archive of testimony from the 8 survivors and corresponds with researchers still attempting to understand what happened. In a 2020 interview, he explained, "We preserve this story not to claim superiority of one faith over another, but because it represents hope in the face of humanity's most destructive creation." Whether one sees divine intervention or scientific mystery, the fact remains that something extraordinary happened here, something that suggests even our most destructive weapons cannot extinguish all life. The scientific investigation continues, with modern researchers applying technologies unavailable to earlier generations. In 2015, a team from Hiroshima University used advanced computer modeling to reconstruct the precise radiation and blast wave patterns around the rectory. Their findings, published in the journal Radiation Research, confirmed the exceptional nature of the case. Using modern simulation techniques and all available historical data, we can state with high confidence that the Jesuit rectory received blast forces exceeding 7 psi and radiation doses above 8 Gray units, conditions that should have resulted in both structural collapse and lethal radiation exposure. Dr. Masaharu Hoshi, the study's lead author, concluded, "After 70 years of investigation, the survival remains inexplicable by standard physics models. Either our understanding of radiation effects is incomplete, or some unknown variable affected this specific location." The research team proposed several new hypotheses, including complex radiation wave interference patterns and potential geological factors, but acknowledged none fully explained the observed outcomes. The case remains open in scientific literature, one of the few documented phenomena from the atomic bombings that continues to resist comprehensive explanation. Beyond scientific and religious interpretations, the story of the Jesuit priests has become woven into the broader cultural memory of Hiroshima. Japanese author Keiji Nakazawa, who survived the bombing as a child and later created the renowned manga Barefoot Gen, included a fictionalized account of the priests in his work. Though not religious himself, Nakazawa presented their survival as emblematic of Hiroshima's unpredictable pattern of death and life, some killed instantly while standing in open fields, others surviving within collapsed buildings. This theme of randomness and meaning in survival pervades Hiroshima's collective narrative. For many hibakusha, bombing survivors, the Jesuit story provided a framework for understanding their own survival when family members and neighbors perished. Tsunao Tsuboi, former chairman of the Japan Confederation of A&H bomb sufferers organizations, referenced the priests in his testimony to the United Nations in 2005. Like the 8 Jesuit priests, many of us survived when we should have died, against all odds and explanations. This creates a responsibility to bear witness, to ensure such weapons are never used again. In this way, the Jesuit miracle transcended its religious origins to become part of Hiroshima's universal message to humanity about nuclear weapons. The interplay between faith and science in interpreting the priest's survival reflects deeper questions about how humans make meaning from unprecedented events. Doctor, Robert Oppenheimer, scientific director of the Manhattan Project, famously quoted the Bhagavad Gita after witnessing the first nuclear test. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." This turn toward ancient religious text by the quintessential modern scientist demonstrated how traditional frameworks of understanding reassert themselves when confronted with forces that transcend conventional experience. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima represented such a moment for humanity, a new threshold of destructive power that challenged existing modes of comprehension. In this context, the Jesuit miracle offered competing interpretive frameworks. Religious observers saw divine intervention protecting the faithful, while scientists confronted the limitations of their models and the possibility of unknown physical phenomena. Father Arupe, who witnessed the aftermath in Nagasaki before meeting the Hiroshima survivors, perhaps best articulated this interpretive flexibility. Science seeks to understand the mechanism of their survival, religion, the meaning. Both questions are valid, and neither precludes the other. The miracle may be that God works through natural laws we have yet to discover. The final word on the Jesuits of Hiroshima perhaps belongs to Father Hubert Schiffer himself. In his last interview before his death in 1982, given to a Catholic publication, he reflected on the significance of their survival. "We survived the atomic bomb because we were living the message of Fatima. We lived and prayed the rosary in that house. We want to tell the world that world peace is possible if the world would only embrace the message of Fatima. Prayer, penance, and conversion." Then, addressing scientific skepticism directly, he added, "I do not ask anyone to accept our explanation uncritically. The facts of our survival are well documented and open to investigation. We were at most 500 meters from the center of the blast. Everything around us was destroyed. Everyone around us was killed. We suffered no radiation sickness. These are the facts. How one interprets them, as divine intervention or as some unknown natural phenomenon, depends on one's worldview. But the most rational conclusion, to my mind, is that God protected us that day, not for our own sake, but to serve as witnesses to the possibility of faith and hope, even in the face of the most terrible weapon humans have ever created." 75 years after the bombing, as nuclear weapons remain a threat to human civilization, the miracle of the Jesuits of Hiroshima continues to challenge our understanding of both physical reality and spiritual possibility, standing as a testament to survival against impossible odds in humanity's darkest hour.